Hey, chess friends, and welcome back. Today, I have a very interesting position to share with you, going for our third exercise, part of GM Jacob Aagaard's book, Excelling at Positional Chess. This position is actually taken from a game played in 1997 at Novgorod, Russia. Playing with the white pieces, we have Boris Gelfand, and playing with the black pieces, we have Garry Kasparov. This position is black to move, and as usual, take 10 to 15 minutes to really understand and analyze the position. And once you think you have the solution, just go ahead and click play, and we can walk through the analysis. All right, so I take it you've taken some time to sort of understand the position, analyze it, and so let's get started. The first thing, as you know me, is to try to understand the material count in the position. And so I see that black has 7 pawns, white has 7 pawns, both sides have 2 knights, 2 bishops, 2 rooks, a queen, and of course the kings. This is an important observation to note as it tells me that both sides have even material. The next thing I like to do is try to understand the piece activity in the position, what each of the pieces are trying to do, and where the action is taking place on the board. So let's start with the black side, and particularly let's start with this bishop on g7. I mean, my oh my, that bishop is going to be powerful. If you look carefully, this bishop has the potential to exert an influence over this entire diagonal. It's literally like a sniper that's stalking its target along the h8 to a1 squares. Now, hiding the bishop is actually this knight on f6. Now, while this knight on f6 and the rook on e8 are both teaming up to target the e4 pawn, this knight on f6 is actually obstructing the view of the bishop on g7. So that tells me that there could be a potential for improvement, possibly rerouting that knight somewhere from f6. Moving forward to the knight on d7, the knight on d7 is holding critical squares like e5, and once we move this knight on f6, even the bishop on g7 will be able to contribute to that goal as well. Aside from the knight on d7, I see that the bishop on a6 wants to have an open diagonal along here, but the problem is that the pawn on b5 is blocking its path. And so it might be logical to play b4 at some point, pushing for some sort of queenside pawn storm / tack. Now, if you look closely, this pawn structure also does resemble something of a Benoni, and that also confirms that black would indeed like to push for some sort of queenside attack, particular opening up this bishop on a6. Now, aside from pushing forward with b4, black's queen and black's rook can also certainly be improved and start to contribute to the queenside pressure. Now, looking for the white side, I think this knight on f3 is similar in behavior to this knight on f6. Knight on f3 is actually obstructing the bishop on g2 from doing its job, which is protecting the e4 square. And also, white typically has ideas of playing something like f2 to f4, so it might make sense to push this knight from f3 and reroute it to a different square in the future. The knight on c3, the rook on e1, and the queen on c2 are all defending this pawn on e4, although it's important to note that this knight on c3 might not be on c3 the whole while, because as we mentioned, black has ideas of pushing b4 to try to boot this knight off c3. White's bishop on c1, obviously not developed, looking for squares like e3 or f4, f4 being a nice square since it can also hit black's undefended d6 pawn. And white's rook, while it doesn't look active or developed at the moment, it is actually playing a very important role in this position. As we mentioned, black wants to play b4, but the problem here for black is that white can play pawn takes b4, and if black answers with c takes b4, black's bishop on a6 is going to be hanging. And so now that we've understood all of the pieces for both sides, we've actually gotten a pretty clear picture of what's going on in the position. As we know, black wants to exert queenside pressure, look for ideas such as b4, b5, b4. possibly reroute the knight on f6 to open up the bishop on g7. And white needs to be careful about this b5, b4 plan, stop it in its tracks, develop the bishop as it can, and protect the e4 pawn. So if black's critical idea is to play b5 to b4, then we need to figure out a way to defend this bishop so that it can be possible. And so the first move that I think that comes to mind is actually just queen to b6. But the problem with playing queen to b6 here is that I see that white can just simply play bishop to e3. And after bishop to e3, this bishop is actually going to be pinning this the queen to this pawn. And so b5 to b4 is very hard to play here. Looking at the position, we also notice that time is of the essence. So if you calculate a little bit here, you'll see that if black plays something natural like rook to c8, trying to develop the rook, get it to exert queenside pressure along the c file, especially along this queen, white's just simply going to develop bishop to e3. And if black continues with queen to c7, the idea to defend the bishop on a6, white is simply going to play bishop to f1, which is very important here, exerting an influence along this diagonal and also deterring this pawn from moving from b5 to b4. If black continues to protect the bishop on a6, well, then white can simply answer that by playing bishop to f4, which is a very nice way in attacking the undefended pawn on d6 and really so tying down black's forces here. So let's go back. So we've looked at queen to b6, and we've looked at ideas such as rook to c8, queen to c7, and queen to b7. And none of these ideas seem to really work as of the current moment. So is there any other move in which black can immediately protect the bishop on a6 and prepare for ideas such as b5 to b4? And if you're thinking what I'm thinking, then yeah, there is a move, and it involves queen to c8. In fact, queen to c8 is what Garry Kasparov played in this game, and so let's see what happened. After queen to c8, white plays bishop to f4. I think it's natural white wants to retaliate by attacking black's undefended d6 pawn, hoping that black will try to defend it with the queen and tie down their forces. Black, of course, simply ignores the threat and continues with their original plan, b5, b4. But let's go back and see, well, what would have happened if white didn't play bishop to f4? And so an alternative that has been suggested is playing bishop to f1. Bishop to f1 is possible here. A sample line goes b4. Black is automatically attacking white's knight. Knight to b5. Of course, if something like pawn takes b4, this doesn't work because a bishop takes f1, rook takes f1, pawn takes b4, and you see that this knight is actually pinned by this queen eyeing the c2 queen as well. And so that's actually highlighting one of the additional advantages of playing queen to c8, not just defending the a6 bishop, but also exerting pressure along the c file. So continuing with the line, if black plays b4, of course, white can play knight to b5. And after knight to b5, black can attack the knight on b5, queen to b8. White will defend, queen to a4. Black will probably retreat the bishop to b7. And after bishop to f4, eyeing the d6 pawn, black will defend. And after a takes b4, knight takes e4, centralizing the knight, protecting the d6 pawn. Knight takes d6, bishop takes d6, queen takes d7, bishop takes f4, pawn takes f4, queen takes f4. We have a rather messy and complex position, but I think we can say that it's just about even. If anything, this probably would have been white's best alternative in the position. So let's go back a couple moves and see what happened in the game. So after bishop to f4, putting pressure on the d6 pawn, as noted, black just simply ignores the threat and continues with b4. Now, after b4, white is forced to move their knight off of the c3 square, but this allows a very extraordinary move in this position. In fact, if you were sure to have solved this problem correctly, you would have seen this move. This is the key positional idea, and it is b3. Boom. This is not good for white. And now you'll see why. If white plays queen takes b3, look what's hanging, e4. And this just allows black to play knight takes e4, centralizing their knight, very strong knight on e4, and of course opening up the bishop to exert its influence over this long diagonal. And if you remember from our previous analysis, that's exactly what black wanted to do, move the knight from the f6 square, open up the bishop, and what better square to move the knight than to the beautiful e4 square. You'll also notice that by playing b3, we have just opened up this very nice b file, and so we can start to put pressure on this weak b2 pawn as well. Now, you might also be wondering, well, what happens if white doesn't take the pawn on b3? Let's say they continue to defend e4. But if you do play queen to b1 here, I mean, just look at this position. Do you really feel that it's actually good for white? Queen on b1, the rook on a1, the knight on a4. What is the knight on a4 even doing? Queen on b1, the rook on a1, very passive pieces. The e4 pawn, while it isn't hanging at the moment, it sure will fall very soon. Black's position is favorable. Okay, so going back to the game, after b3, white does play queen takes b3. Queen takes b3, knight takes e4, landing a very powerful knight. Queen to c2, attacking the knight on e4. Now, if white does not play queen to c2, white could have played something like knight to c3, but this is just an outright mistake, because after rook to b8, queen to c2, boom, rook takes b2, completely annihilating white's queenside. And now you are seeing the true power of the knight, the bishop, all working together to attack the c3 focal point. Boris Gelfand does not fall for this. Instead, he plays queen to c2. And after queen to c2, black simply continues knight d to f6. Black has accomplished everything that he wanted to here, right? The knight on e4, well centralized, very powerful, and it's also supported by the knight on f6. Black doesn't have many coordination problems here. If anything, black has the advantage. White continues by playing g4 here. This move is probably a mistake in the position. White needs to understand that black's biggest threat is this knight on e4. So by playing something like knight to g5 to try to put pressure on e4 knight, this could have been very helpful. So instead, white continues with g4, and after g4, black simply continues queen to d7, eyeing the knight on a4. White continues with g5. Black plays knight to h5, hitting the bishop on f4. White plays bishop to h2. And after bishop to h2, black plays f5. And I think all of you can see that black's advantage is just obvious in this position. I mean, the knight on e4 is very well protected, supported by the pawn on f5. The bishop has long influence over this diagonal, very good for black. Here, white tries to take down this knight on e4 with ideas like knight to c3, but black simply responds rook to b8. Very calm, simple move, taking control over the b file. And here you see that if knight takes e4, then of course the b2 pawn is hanging. White tries to defend it with rook a to b1, but here this is a beautiful positional idea. Bishop takes c3. And while this may seem counterproductive or counterintuitive in the sense that, just a few minutes ago, the knight on a4 was absolutely terrible. It was on the rim, and the bishop on g7 was this monster bishop exerting huge influence over this long diagonal. But black is actually transforming one advantage to another. By sacrificing the bishop for the knight on c3, black's knight on e4 is now very well maintained, and it is unchallenged by white's pieces. And after b takes c3, I think it's clear to see that black has a tremendous position, and it is no wonder that Garry Kasparov went on to win this game. Now, if you enjoyed that, please do like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for our next exercise. Bye for now.